So just, again, I'm just looking at this quickly, when we, say over budget, and then I look at the exhibit, I think it's this exhibit D, where we've broken out the two different SWOS cycles, 2017 and 22. And let's just start there with the original estimated cost of 140. I believe the 140 is the maximum amount that could be collected in revenue from that 60-month eSPLOS cycle, which is different than the cost. You know, so like we, as Mr. Wilson said, you've got interest earnings, state funding, bond proceeds, if you issue them, that all allow you the ability to certainly spend more than what that eSPLOS project period is for, especially if they extend out some period of time.
So for like D.5 in the back of the packet is where I got that number. For example, that would be one of them. So the financial report says original estimated cost, and it kind of breaks it down per project. Does that mean something different than the original estimated cost when that SPLOS started, that we thought that project would cost?
I think that's the SPLOS exhibit from the financial report that we have to put together and publish and all that. And so what that original cost comes from on that is back when the SPLOS project list and collections and all of that were first being thought of, right, for that SPLOS cycle. And so, you know, at that time, the board or the school district came up with and estimated that whatever projects they wanted to do at that time were, 140 if that's, I haven't found the exact exhibit, but
That's
the logic
back.
carries the same either way. As you earn interest, as you get real numbers, as you maybe add a project or change a project, maybe a little bit from what you initially conceived, because many times we're getting a SPLOS renewal and some of these projects aren't happening until 6 years later, 7 years later. As revenue allows, depending on the scenario, your costs potentially could and probably would go up from what you estimated back when you were getting, you know, the SPLOS renewed or passed, or putting some numbers to paper, kind of like we've done, of what we think these projects will cost.
And that kind of brings us like full circle to where we're at right now, because right now we're at the point going into the 2027 SPLOS where we're looking and we're making kind of our initial estimates that would become kind of our original estimated cost. And given these trends, I would say that as we budget these projects, if we continue to follow these trends, we can anticipate that the projects that we think are gonna cost one amount today might end up in totality costing, you know, 130% more in the future, given that the last 3 SPLOS, that seems to be the trend. Or the last two SPLOS, I would say.
Maybe you comment to this on, I think that that's inherent, like that the numbers you put down on paper, maybe 7 years before you actually get a bid on a project, will most likely, I would say, be lower than what they'll actually be, because you just don't know what inflation's gonna do, you don't know, maybe you change your scope a little bit from what you initially thought, maybe a new board comes along and wants to do something a little different, new superintendent, whatever it may be, can certainly change the scope, the cost, the economy, all of that. And so all we try to do is to tell you today from where we're sitting, what, at any point in time, what we think, based on the information that's available to us, we think any single project could cost. You see this other than here, right?
No, I mean, the only comment I would make, and I don't have pretty numbers or information, but one of the thoughts is to try to tie the financing plan to projects that are going to get bid very soon. So that, you know, to the extent that you're doing, you know, you're coming up with a plan of finance and you're 3 3 years are passing, yeah, I mean, there's no telling what those costs are really gonna be then. But if we're selling bonds in the fall or later this year, hopefully, what is it, Harlem, you know, they're gonna be tightening up their numbers all along as we move toward that bond sale date. And you're gonna have a much shorter period of time. I mean, you know, that would be one way that you sort of reduce some of the, risk of having a mismatch. You can put some contingencies in there and do whatever, but, I mean, ultimately, you know, I don't know how to respond to what you said, because I got to read it and look at it and understand the assumptions.
I'd love to see a response to these. I'm reading through, I don't feel like they're too crazy asks on here. This is a lot of work, and I'd like to understand it better from your perspective, to be honest. I don't
Sure.
trust anybody's numbers, because you're not an accountant, but you have the background, and this looks,
You are an accountant.
yeah. So
Well,
I'd like
and I'm not
to,
saying
I'd like to know
I don't
if this is,
Sure.
how accurate this is.
You know, for example, looking at the 2017 to 22 SWOS report, the current estimates for total revenue over the life of that cycle is at $260 million. Now, we only got 140, let's say, authorized, right? But because of bond proceeds, interest, state funding, we're not sure of. E-rate is in here, maybe some other local transfers that we do during the life of that. That's going to change your total revenue, it just is. And so you then maybe accelerate a project you weren't gonna do or thought about, maybe it was on your want but not need list, and now you've said, okay, we got the funding, so let's do it. So that's why I would, to me, saying over budget, I don't know is the right way to say it, in that all we're dealing with is estimates, and as everything is constantly changing, depending on all the factors we've already discussed, so do our plans, right? So do our expenditures. There's no way to know 7 years from now what interest rates are gonna be, right? So we try to be very conservative on what those returns might be, because we don't wanna count on money that's not gonna actually show up and sign a contract, for example. But, so your revenue's gonna fluctuate, therefore your expenditures kind of fluctuate so that you can spend out that project, or that eSPLOS cycle, if you will, down to the last penny, really, which is what the end goal is. And so that's another explanation. I think you could say that if you saw an initial kind of project list that we thought would equal 145 million back in probably 2020, or before that, 2017 to 22. So this was probably 2015 when they formulated these projects and these initial estimates. We're 10 years later, probably, by the time all these proceeds get spent.
And I could really, get on board with what you're saying and move past that particular chart. I mean, that's again, one piece of the puzzle, but even as we're talking, I'm hearing language of, I think we're going to be able to do this, and I think we'll be good with not having to do an additional tax rate for debt bondage and things like that. I hear that type of verbiage of where we're now actually talking about whether or not we're going to cross over into that area with these bonds, but we think we're good, and then I'm comparing that to this constant trend I'm seeing even just with Harlem High from last January. Our CMAR went from 80 million, now we're up to over 100 million. So like you said, things do change, they're unpredictable, COVID could happen, prices go up, so many things could happen, and that's where I'm really probably the biggest thing that I would look at is the debt to SPLOS ratio, because as I'm looking at this, we decided the state funding was pretty negligible, the interest was pretty negligible. Primarily, we're looking at bonds and eSPLOS collections as our major funding mechanisms for this. And truly, I see that there's a trend that we're maybe going in a very spending type direction when I see just the bond debt to SPLOS as we're going into these last three SPLOS, we're at 43%, and then now we're at 73%. And so I think when we're looking at a bond debt to SPLOS ratio, we've in a sense already spent SPLOS up through 2032. And then you're looking at what if, such as happened in, I think it was Arizona, I SPOS because their citizens got together and said, hey, we've done many SPOS for you. Your bond debt is out of control. You need to stop spending and catch up on your bonds debt. And I don't want that to happen to us after 2032 and then we're left with all this bond debt. So I'm kind of thinking from like a fiscal conservative perspective of where are we to where, yes, I'm sure it's true that we could do this. It's just, is this the direction we wanna go where we are so laden with bonds? And again, I don't expect anybody to look at this and digest this. Like I said, it's taken me the last week to really dive in and wrap my mind around this. But it would be something that I'd ask us to take home and look at to where we could maybe have a discussion on this. Looking at some of these numbers, or on the contrary, Alex, you can come back and say, hey, just like you did with this chart, hey, this isn't quite accurate. And we can have that kind of discussion to where if we are gonna move ahead on it, at least I can feel really good about it financially where we're at. Cause it's basically a summary of my concerns based on,
Dr. Flint, Mr. Chairman, would you be okay if Alex were to respond to these, to see how accurate this is?
Well, we wouldn't, no, not really.